Thank you. I welcome you all to the penultimate panel, panel 8, Thoughts of a Generation. The first speaker is Dr. D'Alfonso, and she'll be speaking about exile literature and cultural imagology, the otherness through the experience of Ovid, Exsul. Dr. D'Alfonso received her PhD degree in Culture, Education, Communication at the University of Foggia, with a dissertation entitled The Imaginary of Exile Between Identity, Alterity, and Integration, the Ovid Case and its Reflections on the Modern Migrant. Her PhD followed a master's degree in Philology, Literature, and History at the University of Foggia, with a thesis entitled Sophonisba and His Assistants, From Text to Musical Drama. During her PhD course, Dr. Alfonso has carried out research activities in the Department of Latin Philology of the Complutense University of Madrid. She is currently subject expert in Latin literature, Latin language and literature, Latin rhetoric, and Latin theatre at the Department of Humanities of the University of Foggia, and she's a tutor for the Web Mythology project of the University of Foggia, as well as a collaborator of the ECHO Laboratory, Reception of Latin Culture and the Success of Classical Models in the Arts, also at the University of Foggia. Dr. D'Alfonso participates in national and international congresses and collaborates in the organization of national and international congresses. She has also published several works on a variety of topics of classical interest. I look forward to listening to Dr. Alfonso's presentation, and so I pass the baton on to her. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the impeccable organizers and everyone present. Okay, so I can share my presentation. Okay. Okay, perfect. Just a check, can you read my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, okay. So, 8 AD is the year in which the court poet Publius Ovidius Naso, the immortal author of the Metamorphosis, Magister Amoris, and cantor of the Roman Fasti, is reached on the Elba Island by a personal edict of the Emperor Augustus and condemned to relegatio perpetua without a prior senatorial resolution and without the possibility of delay or appeal. The destination chosen by Augustus is a Greek city in Scythia Minor called Tomis, locus terribilis, and above all, with no return roads. As the Italian scholar Aldo Luisi underlines, until then, no one had ever been sent so far from Rome, moreover, to a place not counted among the places of relegation or exile, and in which there were only barbarians and a small group of Roman soldiers guarding the place. A terrible punishment for a man like Ovid, accustomed to living in contact with the high society, who greatly appreciated his opinions. The crimen carminis and the crimen erroris, which caused the poet a long punitive journey and an irreversible withdrawal from the Roman scene, remain even today a subject of debate among scholars. In general, the accusations made by Augustus in those years were pretexts to eliminate uncomfortable personalities and often dangerously close to the imperial house. Ovid's poetry may have become, in many ways, a space for political dissent and destabilizing tool for the equilibrium of the status quo. An exemplary element of this Ovidian attitude is his closeness to the circle of Julia Major and Julia Minor, the daughter and the granddaughter of the emperor, both condemned for adulterium to the relegatio in Insulam. De facto, the laws of Augustus become a means to clean up the imperial house. To cover the condemnation for subservice acts and crimes against the regime, the Lex Julia de Adulteris Quercendis allows for the removal of inconvenient figures for apparent moral reasons. The poems that Ovid brings together during the exile into autobiographical works, Tristia, Sorrows, and Epistula Exponto, Letters from the Black Sea, are for the Western tradition the most important literary response to banishment. The poet tells in detail the stages of his new existence, the departure from Rome, the abandonment of friends and relatives, the long and tiring navigation in the Mare Clausum, the inclemency of the Agertomitanus, the linguistic difficulties, and the encounter with the indigenous populations, with the Hirsuti and Inumani, Danubian barbarians. The Spanish scholar Claudio Guillen, in an important essay written in 1995, The Son of the Exiles, theorizes the existence of an Ovidian archetype, a literary model that describes the exilic experience as a crisis of the individual, as a loss and emotional mutilation, as an inner split that sinks into nostalgia. With the abandonment of the homeland, the traumatic experience of the journey, the feeling of identity loss, and the linguistic difficulty, a primary object of attention at the center of the elegies is precisely the negative impact with the new community, and most importantly, the forced relationship with the otherness. So, starting from 8 AD, the Bard of Octavianus, fallen out of favor, recounts in his elegies of exile the encounter with those who, in his eyes, are the barbarians for excellence, the inhabitants of the extreme and inhospitable border of the Roman dominion, or Marco Imperi, the Scythians, and the Getae. The Romans had come to dominate the left side of Pontus as far as the mouth of the Danube, while the enemy's bastard and Sarmatians occupied the territories further east. As shown by the geographical map made by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa and displayed in the Porticus Vipsania, it was the Marco Imperi, the extreme, cold, and inhospitable border of Roman dominion. Through the poems of Tristia and of Epistule, the disgraced poet gives us a portrait of the stranger who inhabited those lands. Of the hostes already became an enemy. The men who live inside and outside the city of Tomis are described through the lens of another foreigner. Ovid arrives with his load of cultural ideas, preconceptions, reservations. His is not a neutral gaze, and his reports, which we'll analyze shortly, are influenced by his own individual and cultural identity, by his role as a man and as civis Romanus. In particular, the theory of geographic environmental determinism, style widely spread in the Augustan age, contributes to the poet's metaphorical baggage of beliefs and stereotypes. In the treatise on airs, waters, and places of the Corpus Hippocraticum, for the first time, the principles of geoclimatic determinism are established. According to this theory, shared over the century up to the modernity, the nature of physical space and the conditions of an environment determine the characteristics of its inhabitants from the point of view of the body, physical, and of the character, psychic. Hippocrates argues that the appearance and character of man depend on the climate and in general on the territory of origin. The inhabitants of Europe and Asia owe their distinctive features to the environment in which they were born. So the geographical opposition determines an opposition of psychophysical nature. The moral component of the population also depends mainly on the climate, and the behavioral and character peculiarities develop differently even in the same area. In Europe, the excessively cold climate of the Nordic area differentiates the Scythians from the other peoples of the same continent, while making them similar to the Egyptians, whose climate is, on the contrary, exceptionally warm. Plato also combines Greek ethnocentrism and ideas of environmental determinism, but it is to Aristotle that we owe the diffusion of determinism in Hellenistic culture. So, according to the theoretical lines expressed in the Hippocratic treatise, the nature of a place literally shapes the mind and the body of the inhabitant. This theory also carries with it the fundamental idea of an environmental and climatic superiority that becomes, by natural consequence, ethnic superiority. In the Roman world, many authors demonstrate a thorough knowledge of the theories of determinism, like Cicero, Sallust, Vitruvius, Pliny the Older. For all these authors, the perfect balance of intelligence and strength is represented by Rome and its inhabitants. Ovid openly demonstrates in his Tristia that he followed this vision. He writes, Si velocum specto, in amabilis etquo, esse nil toto tristius orbe potest, si homines vixunt, homines hoc nomine digni, quamquam lupis eve, lus veritatis abent. The inhabitant of these lands is recognized by the poet's distrustful gaze as hostis, like the territory of relegation, precisely locus hostilis. So, starting from these deterministic convictions, the exile poetry of Ovid can be analyzed as an archetypal case of literature influenced by the so-called ethnotypes, that is, stereotypes relating to populations and nations. The complexity of the approach to otherness and the value of the active observation of the stranger has found a systematization in the interpretative theory of imagology. Developed in France in the mid-20th century and flanked by post-colonial studies and migrant literature, the interpretative theory of imagology branch of comparative literature looks at all writings that create the imaginary of the other, that formulate judgments on the inhabitants and of unknown lands, that show the comparison between the self of the writer who observes and the stranger he observed. According to a recent definition of Joe Plersen, coordinator of the website Imagological, it can be explained as the mental or discursive representation or reputation of a person, group, ethnicity, or nation. The imagological investigation deals with images, stereotypes, judgments, and commonplaces on the otherness that literature has always conveyed in ancient and modern times. Through the imagological filter can be retraced the eternal experience of the encounter with the foreigner, says the scholar Nora Moll. It is therefore a study of discourse on the other in the work of a single writer, of a single literature, in all the literatures of a culture class. The other can be perceived in three different ways. It can be overestimated, that is with mania, it can be despised, that is with phobia, or it can be considered culturally equal, that is with philia. In the first case, the literature becomes ideological literature. In the second case, it becomes racist or imperialist literature. In the third case, it becomes intercultural literature. So the question is not whether the author has correctly represented the foreign population, but its literary construction and what it conveys. Imagological research investigates the images or meta-images that an author creates in his work and the specifically concerned attributions of moral or characterological nature. As Moll suggests again in an essay of 1999 entitled Images of the Other, the representations of foreign countries are very old precisely because they meet the need of every human society to draw a boundary between what is familiar and what belongs to the unknown. In Italy, like in the rest of Europe, comparative literature has further developed the imagological field, especially from the late 1980s and from a cultural point of view. In particular, like Nora Moll demonstrated, both as intercultural and as intracultural imagology. The theoretical concepts, the survey methodologies, the lexical lists, and the main imaginaries necessary for the imagological investigation were all collected in an essential and monumental work published by Manfred Beller and Joe Plersen, entitled Imagology, the cultural construction and literary representation of a national characters. The third part of the volume, dedicated to relevant concepts and the related disciplines, reveals in many of its terms the clear proximity to perceptions and ideological construction already present in classical antiquity. Says the German scholar Manfred Beller in his definition of the term barbarian, the most frequent hetero images are the appellations barbarian or savage. Barbarians are considered uncivilized brutes, uncouth in appearance and manners. The scholar, starting from the concepts of the Greek word, analyzes also the classical Roman perspective, and he mentions the Germanic tribes described by Tacitus in the first century. But barbarian, as climate, identity, topos, are all terms evidently useful and used to describe Ovid's experience of contact with otherness. So, before the Germans of Tacitus, the Skytians of Ovid Exsul represent a paradigmatic object of the imagological studies in the perspective of a cultural confrontation. The purpose of this investigation at this point is precisely to identify the elements present in Ovid's exilic work that show a conditioned reading of the Getic reality. The approach of the poet is marked, at least at first, by the phobia, and he gives us an imagological portrait of the Getic stranger. Describing to the reader the places of his relegatio, Ovid often speaks without distinguishing between Scythia, Scythica ora, Scythicus orbis, Fines, Scythici istri. Scythia embraced that part of territory north of Tomis, included between the rivers Istro, the Danube, and Tanai, Don, beyond which the land of the Sauromati begins. But Scythia meant, in the geographical vision of a Roman, everything that overlooked the Black Sea. As McGowan says, the western portions of the Black Sea region was known to most educated Romans, rather generally as Scythia, a point that Ovid underscores repeatedly in his poems from exile. We can read some of the poet's notes. Allende next the stars already mentioned there, Oldsme, a region shriveled with stiffening cold, beyond are Bosporus and the Tanais and the Scythians marshes, and the scattered names of a region hardly known at all. Further still is nothing but a cold that forbids habitation. Alas, how near to me is the margin of the world. The topos of the sterile Isis Scythia and its inhabitants passes through the work of other other authors during the Augustan age. Virgil, for example, in the third book of the Georgics, describes the land in detail. Everything is perpetually covered by ice, the soil produces nothing, the winter is harsh, farming cannot be practiced due to the extreme cold that kills the cattle. Horace and Persius also speak of the territory, reporting the communist opinion about the climate and the belligerence of the sky of the Scythians. An important source of these descriptions are the works of Herodotus and Hippocrates that even Ovid knew. We can read in Ovid's work numerous examples of descriptions of the frost in the area. The topic connected to the description of the icy climate repeatedly makes its appearance and runs through the entire work. The other Tomitanus, the territory surrounding Tomis, is also sterile and icy. The few resources of agriculture and livestock are often threatened by enemy raids. According to his many admissions, Ovid lives constantly alert in an insecure urbs, prisoner of a world that does not belong to him if he follows rules of life that are very different from those enforced in Rome. The same city seems to contain in its name a barbaric curse, reported in an entire elegy, the 9th of the third book of Tristia. So the pre-established image, the result of the poet's prejudices prevails. A city that owes its name to Medea can only be the city of a cursed land, a land of constant struggles. Many nomadic Getae tried to reconquer the territories occupied by Romans, and the same Geta who lives in the city, who crosses the same streets as the poet, who lives next to his house, is always an enemy. Quoting Roger Batti, for Ovid, the barbarian war did not begin outside the walls of the Greek city, but lay equally, though less hostilely, within it. The poet's greatest fear is that of the so-called Getaization, that is the influence, especially cultural, of the indigenous population. The contact with the otherness is configured as a real confrontation. The poet feels threatened from every point of view, as a man and as a civis Romanus, and fears any contact that could undermine the strenuously defended Italic identity. For him, Getaization is an equivalent of barbarization. Having considered these environmental aspects quickly, we can now examine the portrait, an imagological portrait that Ovid paints of Tomis Getae, with whom he first contact. The Getae, who live outside and inside the city, are rigidi, crudi, squalidi, duri, hirsuti, truces, sevi. These are all the negative terms present in numerous and different passages of the elegies. They are cruel, savage, and rude men. This portrait is precisely imagological because it's influenced by the cultural and individual background of Ovid, in primis as Roman. The poet recreates and confirms, in this as in many other verses, a national meta-image, an ethnotype, the image of the barbarian inhabitant of the distant Black Sea, negatively influenced by the climate and environmental condition of its extreme land. The language is also an element of extreme distance, and the poet fears Getaization also from a linguistic point of view. This loss of the Latin sermo is considered by the poet to be the worst form of betrayal of the Roman identity, as we can read in these verses. The initial decisive closure to the idea of bilingualism is also a choice conditioned by the Getic ethnotype that is fed by Ovid. The Getic language is a barbaric ensemble of guttural sounds delivered by a barbarian population. I have just said initial closure of the poet because, as I reach my conclusion, in the course of Ovid's work, it is possible to identify a series of not too hidden clues that contradict the poet himself, surprisingly breaking the lines of his narrative conditioned by its load of deterministic beliefs, prejudices, Roman conventions. If Ovid contributes through his work to confirm the portrait of the Scythian barbarian, thus demonstrating that it can be the subject of an imagological analysis, at the same time, he indulges in some moments of what would seem a more sincere and human vision. At the end of the last book of Tristia, he declares, Barbarus hic ego sum, it's me, here and now, the barbarian. This declaration is revolutionary because it turns the gaze on the barbarians, on the Getae. Ovid puts himself into question, and so does his ideas. Moreover, he now has a great advantage in dealing with frightening otherness, the direct vision, the autopsy. The encounter with the foreigner is real. It doesn't stop at a report formulated remotely and based on what is disseminated by the common opinion. As a demonstration of the weight of judgment and stereotype, we have in some verses the real conviction of the poet about the Getae now built directly in their land. This perspective emerges unexpectedly. These are just some examples. Therefore, in Ovid's writing of the Exile, there is the literature marked by rejection, and the intercultural literature, there is phobia and philia. The imagological portrait of the stranger is unexpectedly confronted by the real image. The ethnotype collides with the man, an interesting point that could be further explored. Ovid, in its complexity, once again demonstrates all its richness, a richness that it is essential to continue to investigate through the most recent and modern methodologies of literary analysis. After all, a migrant poet like Ovid cannot fail to be constantly modern. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much.